Okay, Ethan, thanks for joining me on Real Vision.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Maybe for the audience that isn't familiar with your background, you could do a little bit of an intro into, how you got into the space and a bit of your background. I know you come from a pretty diverse background compared to some other people. You're not from finance, so take it away.
I think a lot of people, well, maybe on Real Vision, a lot of people are in finance, but in the cryptocurrency world, there's, I think, a lot of diversity in background. So my pedigree, I guess, is in biophysics. That's what I studied in university. Specifically, I was interested in the problem of the origin of life and how it is in a universe that's allegedly always running down, according to the second law of thermodynamics, that we have, organisms and ecosystems and these phenomenal beings that run themselves up, so to speak, that, this sort of incredible phenomenon of emergence. And this was really what I was studying and trying to understand, and slowly starting to apply it to, the political realm, the economic realm as well, as I was learning about, the nature of economics and the financial system, and came across Bitcoin. And it sort of dawned on me that, this was back in 2013, that what we were seeing with Bitcoin was the same phenomenon I was studying in the biophysical medium, but happening in the digital medium, the sort of origin of life, right? These emergent, coordinating, sustainable organisms, essentially. And so that really struck me that, if the internet was this sort of revolution in biological communication, that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies were this revolution in coordination. And that was really powerful for me. And I went pretty much all in to the cryptocurrency world at that point. I was doing a master's degree, or had just started a master's degree that was supposed to be in machine learning. But I spoke to my professor, and I was like, look, either I'm not going to do a master's degree at all, or it's going to be on cryptocurrencies or blockchains. And he was like, as long as it counts as computer engineering, you're good with me. So I was fortunate to have a very, very flexible and supportive advisor. And so I ended up doing my thesis on Tendermint, which was, the project I had co-founded with Jay Kwan at the time. The thesis was called Tendermint, Byzantine Fault Tolerance in the Age of Blockchains, and sort of really dove into the contextualizing what was happening in the blockchain space and proof of stake and so on in the sort of longer tradition of the academic study of consensus protocols. That's how I got started. And then we could talk about Cosmos and so on. Yeah.
Sounds good. And for those that maybe aren't as familiar, Tendermint is the consensus engine that powers Cosmos, and as well now a bunch of other chains in the cryptocurrency space. Maybe let's step back a bit. Like, at what point did you start to get into the cryptocurrency space? Like you mentioned around 2013. Like, what was that trigger?
I had started to be turned on a little bit to, the problems in the financial system, and sort of most of my life, I imagined, after I got over the fact that I wasn't going to be in the NBA, probably when I was like 14 or something, as all young boys do, I guess. I was like, okay, I'll be a professor, right? I'll hang out in the ivory tower and whatever. And I guess sometime in 2011 or 2011, 2012 era, I started learning about the financial system and the sort of structure of the economy, and started listening to podcasts and gold bugs, and learning a little about the sort of Austrian view and stuff like that. Bought my first bars of silver and drained my bank accounts, and just a young, irresponsible 20-year-old, and pretty much had become disenchanted as people do when they start learning about these things. And so in early 2013, I'd heard about Bitcoin in 2012, I think, but I didn't really understand it. I went to the Wikipedia page. There were like too many things I didn't get, so I just sort of moved on. Then in 2013, it came up again, and so I dug in and spent time actually trying to understand, okay, what is this Merkle tree thing? What is this, cryptographic signature thing? And it started to...
What we're showing you here on our YouTube channel is just the tip of the iceberg. No matter where you are in your financial journey, whether you're a beginner just looking to break into the market, or a financial professional looking to up your game, Real Vision has something for everyone. Every day, our team of expert journalists provides in-depth analysis, written reports, access to live streams, and access to our community, The Exchange, where you can interact with people just like you from all over the world. For just $1, you can unlock all of this and more at realvision.com. Try our Essential tier. If you like what you see, it's only $20 a month thereafter. So click on the link in the description, go to realvision.com, and see what you think. We look forward to seeing you there.
Then in 2013, it came up again, and so I dug in and spent time actually trying to understand, okay, what is this Merkle tree thing? What is this, cryptographic signature thing? And it started to click. And it was really, I think, the Cyprus bail-in crisis in 2013, where there was, the sort of in the midst of the Eurozone crises of that time, where, the government bailed in the banks by giving, depositors a haircut. And that was sort of, I think, illuminating for a lot of people, not just me, but for a lot of people, that was the first time they really sort of were like, oh man, the banks aren't safe. We need a different sort of safe asset, something that's digitally native. And that was Bitcoin. And that was the first time I actually, tried to purchase a Bitcoin. And I had been trying for a few weeks, and I was pretty annoyed that I couldn't purchase the new internet money over the internet. And I had to actually find a human being in Toronto and go into his shop and give him cash. And so that was kind of frustrating. It's a little bit better today, but honestly, not by much. So yeah, that was sort of how I got into it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. For me, it was a little bit later, but it was kind of, seeing similar things. I think like a lot of people in the space, there's a bunch of events that kind of added up to then going there's something a little bit different here. There may be a different way of doing things compared to what we grew up with. Take me to, how did you come up with Tendermint and how you kind of got into Cosmos? How did you make that switch, or what was the trigger in your mind where I'm going to make a new consensus mechanism?
Sure. So I can't take credit for inventing Tendermint. So that was my partner, Jay Kwan. And so that was in 2014. So, by early 2014, we had all seen the Ethereum white paper. Being in Toronto, there was a pretty heavy Bitcoin meetup scene, and Vitalik was there and a lot of the early Ethereum people. And it sort of became, something of an Ethereum meetup. And so we were going there, every week or every couple of weeks, and, getting Vitalik to teach us about Merkle trees and, however all this stuff worked. But that was also around the time that people were starting to think about new models of proof of stake, essentially, right? Ways to deal with the problems of proof of work. And there were already a few sort of existing proof of stake competitors like PP Coin or, NXT, I think already existed around that time. But the problems with them was that they as people would say, in proof of stake, you have nothing at stake, which was sort of this, ironic quip that people would throw around. And so early that year, Vitalik had come up with this idea of what he called Slasher at the time, where to participate in a proof of stake consensus protocol, you would have to actually make some deposit of your stake and lock it up so that there would be something at stake. And if you were later found to misbehave or try to cause a fork, you would lose that deposit. And that was very inspiring for a lot of people. And it was around that time that it was okay, Ethereum's going to ultimately move to proof of stake. Of course, we're, 7 years later and we're not quite there yet, but, there's been a lot of progress. But anyway, I think it was around June that Jay Kwan came up with the Tendermint protocol, and he was sort of, going through older academic literature on Byzantine fault tolerance and consensus protocols, and found some stuff that he could understand and could basically modernize into the blockchain context, and that he felt he could use for public cryptocurrencies and so on. And so, I had heard him on a podcast talking about Tendermint, this new consensus without mining approach, and I was pretty taken with that. And sort of later in 2014, I was working for a company now known as Monax, then they were called Eris. They were basically the first company to try to commercialize the Ethereum technology, to bring the Ethereum virtual machine and so on to enterprises. And we knew that in order to do that, we needed a better consensus algorithm. We couldn't use the Nakamoto consensus and the proof of work and so on. So we were looking for an alternative. And so when we came across Tendermint, we were like, oh, this is maybe this. Not only could this work because it uses classic academic consensus protocols that could work in enterprise, but it could also work for the future of cryptocurrencies and blockchains more generally. And so that sort of kicked off my collaboration with Jay. And so I was sort of like his, first follower, so to speak. And we sort of co-founded the project moving forward from there together. And by 2016, after I'd published my master's thesis on Tendermint, we were looking to actually now sort of move away from the enterprise model and bring this consensus protocol to life in the public realm, right? Going back to the roots of sort of public cryptocurrency networks and solving some of the outstanding problems in the existing cryptocurrency network: speed, scalability, security, flexibility, and so on. And so that led us to come up with this model for Cosmos, which was the idea that, in the future, there's going to be many, many blockchains, thousands, if not millions of them. They can't use proof of work, obviously, because it's too destructive and energy intensive. So we need a friendly, sustainable alternative. And that is the model of Tendermint and proof of stake. And we want each community and each group of individuals or whoever wants to start such a chain to have sort of ownership over their blockchain sovereignty, as we call it, and yet still have all the different chains be able to interoperate with each other. And so, from that sort of desire and motivation emerged the Cosmos vision and values of sovereignty and interoperability, of a world of millions of chains where each community is sort of sovereign in their own right and yet interoperable with all the others. And that sort of birthed the Cosmos project in the summer of 2016. And, 5 years later, we're starting to actually realize that vision with now, over $100 billion, I think, worth of market cap on different Cosmos-based blockchains. And our inter-blockchain communication protocol, IBC, is now live. So those chains can start to communicate with each other. And, there's a lot more coming.
Yeah, I think that was a major step. Thanks for the great overview and background. It's fascinating, like the transition, as well as, I think when we met originally, this was about a year and a bit ago when we met, I was really impressed with the engineering thought that went into Cosmos, like really, because I think one of the challenges that anybody who's worked in Ethereum and Bitcoin is that those projects are pretty monolithic, like big in the sense that the code base is reasonably big. It does a lot of things all in one single code base. And usually the trend in software engineering has been to kind of componentize things and break things up into their different architecture layers. And I remember when you were presenting Cosmos at the Creative Destruction Lab in Toronto, I was like, oh, okay, these guys have like basically done what we said needs to be done internally, where they've decoupled the consensus layer from, some of the networking pieces to some of the actual smart contract layer and the interoperability pieces. And I think, congrats recently on the IBC launch. I think that was a big one, not only for the Cosmos ecosystem, but for the entire space, for people to start to see now over the next 6 to 12 months, how these networks can kind of interoperate. Because I think what we're seeing on the Ethereum ecosystem is people are trying to bridge to other chains and doing so successfully. And I think you guys are involved in some of that work as well. But it'll be interesting to see how that kind of common underlying stack of technology, whether it's the consensus or the APIs themselves, if that really starts to expand all these networks quite quickly. I think that's my thesis, is that, right now what happened is Bitcoin was kind of this base money layer, essentially, or store of value layer that a bunch of chains kind of built on, and that seeded a bunch of these networks. But then Ethereum came along and made things more programmable. So everybody jumped to that. And then very quickly, I think, Ethereum kind of snowballed almost a little bit quicker than I think everybody anticipated in terms of the actual software engineering structure. Like the software teams, I think, are working quite hard on that. But the challenge is that it's still pretty clunky to work with, like anybody who's actually doing dev with Ethereum is like, it's still pretty clunky compared to, it feels like 1990s kind of a little bit, or like early web. And I think with these next layers, what we're starting to see is because of that decoupling, people are built on ERC20s because it's become this common spec for issuing a token, which has worked out really well. But I think what you guys have done is, like, to me, separated these different layers and made it so that people can kind of mix and match even the underlying core pieces in order to build their own networks and still have that underlying tech so that they can all talk to each other. And I think that's a really key piece, because that's not really something you can do easily within the Ethereum ecosystem. Like, it's still not super easy to have even two Ethereum chains necessarily interoperate.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, a big part of our motivation, it's funny, we saw this in 2016 and it's still kind of the case today, even though it's starting to change, was that the stack for building blockchain applications was very monolithic at the time. You had a limited set of options. It was take the Bitcoin code base and fork it, right? It wasn't modular at all. The whole thing is sort of compounded together. And, Bitcoin core developers over the years have done a lot of work to improve this, but still largely the same situation, right? If you want, you basically have to fork it, right? And so Ethereum came along and said, okay, instead of that, let's build an entire virtual machine environment so people can build smart contracts that will run on top of our virtual machine. But the virtual machine design, it was a toy. It never really should have gotten out in some regard, right? It's not a safe design. There's a lot of quirks and a lot of flaws, and everyone knows this. This isn't like a secret or some kind of attack on Ethereum. Like it's well understood that there are problems with the Ethereum virtual machine and with Solidity and so on. And you're relatively confined, and worse, not only you're confined to that development environment, which is still quite immature, even though it's the most advanced in sort of the smart contract world. You're stuck. As an application developer, you have no sovereignty, right? You're sort of beholden to the whim of the larger Ethereum network, right? And there's good and bads. On the one hand, the security is sort of provided for you, right? You don't have to worry about coming up with your own security for the network. The Ethereum miners take care of that for you. But they can make changes, and if the Ethereum network upgrades, or if the gas prices get too high, it could completely mess up the economics of your own application, right? And so it's very similar to like, a city-state 2000 years ago being taken over by the Macedonian Empire, right? Where it's like, okay, now you don't have to worry about coming up with your own army and defending yourselves, but you do have to pay taxes to Alexander the Great or, whatever. And so there's sort of that loss of sovereignty. And so, the Cosmos idea was essentially to solve both of these things, to restore sovereignty by, through this model of application-specific chains. So rather than like the notion of a world computer that would handle all of the world's computing and you just have to write your contract and deploy it and forget about it, the model here is you actually build the entire blockchain serves your own application, right? And that way, it's not beholden to some larger group of miners or someone that don't care about your application. It's specifically designed for your application, and the validators and the community that sort of support it and run it are actually there for the particular application that's running on top of it, right? So you get that sovereignty, but you also get a development environment that is mature in the sense that we didn't invent a new programming language. We didn't come up with some new virtual machine. We said, take an existing programming language like Golang, but you can also use others. We built a framework so that you can actually build applications, batteries included, but you can plug in at whatever level you'd like. So if you want maximum flexibility, you can do whatever you want, add whatever level of concurrency or cryptography primitives, the sort of anything you can program in Go is accessible in a Cosmos-based blockchain. Or you can take the batteries included approach and sort of just write a little module and inherit everything else, the proof of stake, the governance, the cryptography, whatever, from the sort of larger Cosmos SDK framework in Go. And so that has really resonated with people. And one analogy we like to use is sort of, you can imagine Bitcoin is like a very early stage computer. It takes up a whole room. It doesn't have much functionality. Not that many people can use it, right? And Ethereum is like, moving to this like mainframe timeshare model where lots of people can use it, but they all have to log into the same mainframe. It still takes up a whole room. It's kind of in one place. And there's this, this idea that, one mainframe will carry all of the world's computing, right? Obviously that's ridiculous. And that's not what happened. What happened is we got, highly commodified and decentralized computing devices. Now everyone has their own, microprocessor on their desk, in their pocket, and so on. They have sovereignty over those devices. They can, do what they like with them, install whatever programs they want, of course, within limits, but and then they connect them to each other using standard interoperability protocols like TCP, like the Internet Protocol, and so on. And so that's really the model of Cosmos, to be this kind of Internet of blockchain that enables many different blockchains to exist, millions of them, just like we have billions of computing machines, and then to connect them with standard protocols like TCP. In our case, we call it IBC, the Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, but there are a lot of analogs between the way IBC works and the way TCP works in terms of the layers, in terms of the guarantees you get, the security model, and the ability to build applications on top. And sort of that's the approach that Cosmos took to resolving these issues around sovereignty and the development environment and so on.
Yeah, I think it's super, super interesting. Like the approach that you guys have taken has been, I'm really quite enamored almost. Like it's quite clever, I think, the way that you guys have been thinking about it. And it took me a little bit, maybe because I'm a little bit behind you or a little stupider, but it took me a bit to kind of wrap my head around how that might start to work and how some of these networks start to scale out. But I think we are seeing that emerge, that, regardless of whether it's Ethereum and even some of the layer 2 stuff that's happening, or whether it's different layer 1 chains. So we're seeing basically, in order for things to scale out, you do need to have a bunch of sub networks, so to speak. And I agree with you. I remember we were talking about this, that I'm with you in that we're going to see a bunch of purpose-built interoperable chains. And we're starting to see that, I think, emerge now, even with, Binance Smart Chain and some of these different attempts at creating things that are purpose-built. I know there's stuff happening in the Cosmos ecosystem like Terra's blockchain around payments and some of the money flows. Maybe to simplify a bunch of the stuff that we talked about for people who aren't developers, I think the way that I look at the Cosmos ecosystem and the stuff that you guys have built within Cosmos is it's really a toolkit for anybody to build their own blockchain networks. But because you're using the same common APIs, other chains that are built with that same toolkit can easily interoperate.
That's right.
Right. And that's how you can get that scaling, as well as the ability to control, to build things that are application specific and that work really well and have core primitives built into the network that work well for the application you're trying to use it for, whether that's lending or payments or money market or voting and governance or all sorts of different applications. So I think that's the way that I've kind of looked at it. Maybe you can go into a little bit. We didn't touch on, you were involved in Cosmos before. You were helping set it up and work it. Now you're working at Informal Systems. Maybe you can talk about what you guys are doing at Informal and a bit of the transition. And then I'd like to hear about some of the research you guys have been doing lately.
Sure. So Cosmos has a pretty complex web of organizations that are involved. So the organizational structure is itself pretty decentralized and reflects the sort of Cosmos values of sovereignty and interoperability. We have a bunch of like sovereign independent entities that are all kind of interoperating with each other. At the end of the day, the sort of human collaboration is always the hardest part of all of this. We like to think all our problems are technical, but they're social political. And at some level economic. But anyway, so there are a number of Cosmos entities that I've been involved with and am still involved with. There's the nonprofit, the Interchain Foundation in Switzerland, which I'm on the foundation council, essentially a board member of, which funds a lot of the development. There's also the Tendermint Inc. company in the US that I helped co-found and build up. I was the CTO there for a while. There've been some changes there over the last couple of years, but they're still doing a lot of development, design, product work, and especially these days on the decentralized exchange that's about to launch on Cosmos, hopefully in around a month or so. Sometime last year, so I had gone from the Tendermint Inc. to the Interchain Foundation to build up the sort of nonprofit capacity, the grants program, stuff like that. We built up a research team, and we decided to spin out early last year into a new company to explore a number of avenues. We wanted to explore and experiment with cooperative ownership models. So the new company, Informal Systems, which I'm the CEO of, is structured as a cooperative. So it's effectively, one person, one vote system. We think that's sort of, the right model for technology companies moving forward for many reasons. But we're also focusing on a number of, technology objectives. So we're still sort of core developers of the Cosmos ecosystem. We do a lot of protocol design. We're building some core components for IBC, but we're building out in Rust to sort of expand the ecosystem into the Rust community and offer new libraries and new tools that leverage sort of Rust performance and safety guarantees. But we also do a lot of formal verification work, which is to say work to guarantee the quality and correctness of software using advances over the last few decades in mathematics and in computer science to actually prove that the software you're building is correct or does what you think it should, right? And so we've been building. We use TLA Plus a lot, which is a formal language for modeling systems and verifying certain properties of them. And we're working on building connections between these sort of formal models and the actual software. For instance, things like model-based testing, which is an approach we're pursuing now, where you can write very simple, very short tests that are only a few lines of TLA Plus that would capture very complex scenarios that might be hundreds of lines of code to actually write, in the native programming language. We can write them in, 10, 20 lines in TLA Plus and then still generate the test to run against real implementation. So that's been really exciting. Starting to see some results for that. And we're also running a validator on the Cosmos Hub network and a number of other Cosmos networks. That's called the Cephalopod Equipment Corporation. So if you're interested in participating in any of these networks or delegating to any particularly active validators, we're pretty active as the Cephalopod validator. So yeah, we sort of have a vertically integrated stack from the actual operating the software to developing it in Rust to formally verifying it to the protocol design work. So you can check this out, informal.systems.
Yeah, interesting. So you guys are you're still heavily involved in the Cosmos ecosystem, but what's obviously been happening is that it's decentralizing over time, right?
That's
You're
right,
having
yeah.
more and more parties or entities get involved in various capacities.
That's right. Yeah.
Very cool. So what, I know some of the stuff that we talked about before previously off camera, as well as, you hinted at here, thinking about, the vision for Cosmos, I think, was to create this toolkit so that people can build interoperable networks and, as you mentioned, can have sovereignty. I know one of the things that we've talked about before is this idea of community currency, or, bringing things back to more of a localized economies that are interoperable.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that kind of playing out? Like, I mean, maybe you can expand on that thought, because I know you've thought about this a ton.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I sort of see, a historical trajectory or progression over history of going from, you could say initially as city-states and small villages towards these very large empires, then towards nation states. And the question is sort of what's coming next. And at some level, that's a story, if you're thinking about from empires to nation states to what's next, at least, of, the struggle between sovereignty and sort of subservience, right? Or subsidiary. And, the problem is that with these empires and even now with the nation states, the political body is kind of too large to sufficiently represent its constituency, right? And the sort of on the ground society is so complex and things are moving at such an accelerating rate that it's very difficult for the institutions of a federal government to actually adequately represent the needs and desires and values, especially of its citizenry. And we see that in the sort of rampant polarity in modern political discussions, right? That arguably, I'm sure there's potentially many reasons for this, but arguably it's because the level of government is actually too big to handle the problems here, right? And so in the same way that the empires sort of broke down into these nation states where at a smaller level, people were like, well, we share a common set of values, maybe a common language, a common geographical region. We want to exert our own sovereignty rather than being ruled by this, continent level empire, say, we are the nation of France or, the nation of the United States of America and so on. I can foresee, especially now, with more than half the population living in cities, a sort of similar thing happening at the more municipal level, right? In many ways, municipalities today are sort of creatures of the state. They don't really have any sovereignty in their own right. They're, puppets, say, of the province or of the state they're in. I think we're maybe on the verge of a kind of revolution, let's say. Hopefully it won't be, bloody or violent, where we'll see municipalities gain a greater amount of sovereignty. And with that will potentially additionally be some level of monetary sovereignty and a sort of proliferation of currencies, maybe one for each city. And people hear that and they think, oh, that's absurd. Like, we can't possibly have that many currencies. How will we manage it? It's going to be complex. Like, floating exchange rates for countries are hard enough as it is, and all of that's probably true. But I would say a couple of things. One is that historically, there were always many currencies, right? It was sort of common in the past for thousands of years for people to have to deal with, local currencies that were issued by some local kingdom or whatever, but also more global currencies for the empires that they were under. And, and yes, it was kind of messy and you need currency exchangers and so on, but it also better reflects the diversity of the world. And trying to sort of denominate everything in a single global currency, I think is a big mistake and the source of a lot of our problems, because it's sort of too low dimensional to adequately reflect people's actual values, right? And hence we end up chronically undervaluing the things that actually keep our society alive. And this is sort of, best demonstrated in the way that, in the sort of the issues with essential workers that the pandemic has brought out, that the people we claim are the actual essential workers for our society are somehow, paid the least. So obviously there's something fundamentally wrong in the way we value things in society. And, to my mind, a significant, one major reason for that is because we've tried to use only a single currency that's issued by, a single nation state to capture all of the world's, to denominate all of the world's value. And I think that's a big problem. So the blockchain space has, developed and evolved a number of new primitives in the decentralized finance world, things like bonding curves and automated market makers that can actually do a lot to enable, to reduce the barriers and the frictions to having a proliferation of currencies, right? And to make it a lot easier to move between them if there are many. So I sort of see us leveraging those kinds of technologies to actually be able to move into a world where we could have, a currency per city or something like that. And I can't pretend to know exactly what this is going to look like, but it does seem like our sustainability as a species, as a society, as a civilization, really is going to depend on greater levels of self-sufficiency and sort of localism and more local, cooperative, stronger, economies, rather than the kind of globalized, we can depend completely on this sort of global, foreign supply chain. COVID, I think, really helped illuminate why that's a problem, those sorts of dependencies. And a lot of, countries are now looking at, we better make sure we have some local supply chains. And that's one thing that's sort of getting the ball moving on this. But I think there are larger trends as well that are just going to keep pushing for more local sovereignty and more self-sufficiency. And that doesn't necessarily have to come at the expense of global cooperation, right? I think that there is a world where we can sort of have both and constantly be negotiating, both local sustainability, but also global cooperation. And the proliferation of municipal currencies is going to play a role in that, because I don't really see them all as fully independent, but as part of, what I call a fractal hierarchy of money. That will span from sort of the local money to global money and back. And again, I can't pretend to know exactly what that's all going to look like, but I think these themes of municipal sovereignty, of this sort of monetary revolution we're undergoing in cryptocurrencies, and the ability of these new primitives like AMMs, automated market makers, and bonding curves to actually provide new approaches to macroeconomics and to bridging these different let's say currency regions together, is sort of unexplored territory with a lot of potential. So that's sort of what I'm looking forward to, and the sort of longer term vision of Cosmos that has really kept me super motivated is really this model of localism, of empowering smaller local communities, of being able to better isolate, or not isolate, it's not the right word, but protect communities from large scale global financial fluctuations, right? To not have some little bank failing over here cause a massive cascade across the financial system that causes all these people in unrelated rural communities to lose their jobs, right? So building a sort of more sustainable, anti-fragile ecosystem of economies, rather than this one highly coupled, highly fragile global system. That's really what I'm working towards, and I think what the Cosmos project and vision is really about.
It's really interesting. It's a really different view, I would say, on the current state of the world, because right now, the internet basically opened up, and travel, of course, but internet in particular really opened up the world to everybody. And so I think, what you're kind of suggesting is that maybe there's a better way to actually bring some of that back, so that we do have a bit more, almost a return to tribalism, sort of, because I think we do have almost that happening already in the cryptocurrency space, and even on the internet as a whole. You have your tribes or subreddits that you maybe subscribe to, of people that you kind of agree with or have a particular view on, or particular interest in. Lots of people in their communities, and even in there's still existing places where they legitimately have a tribal community where it's 100 people or 150 people, 200 people. And I think there's I forget the study, but there was something basically that I read, that you really, as a person, can really only have a certain level of meaningful connections.
Sure.
Where before the level of human connection starts to degrade over time because of the anonymity, or because you haven't built a bond with somebody. And I think that, for I remember, it was somewhere in the 150 to 200 person range, or 100 to 200 people. Number. And I think that, it's really interesting to be able to take that concept that hasn't been able to scale, basically because of physical and because of the barriers around money, and being able to do commerce is really clunky. And, because people have tried local currencies.
Sure.
But then now I think you're right, with some of these technologies that have emerged, it could be possible to take that same concept, but then scale it to be able to be interoperable around the world. And so I think, I remember when you first told me this, I was like, this guy's crazy. I don't think this makes any sense. But
we've come around.
I think COVID has actually highlighted some of this, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
But I think even, it's interesting, the more that I've dug into this idea, it could work. I mean, I think there's lots of barriers, sure, lots of challenges, but I think it could work. I mean, we're I'm in Calgary, for example. You're in Toronto, I believe, Waterloo area. And in Calgary, we've had a Calgary coin for a long time.
Sure.
Nobody uses it.
Right.
Part of that's because of the tooling and like acceptance, there's those network effects that need to be built up as well as the ease of use. But I think a lot of, we've seen experiments even recently where people were doing local stimulus amid the COVID pandemic to try and encourage people to shop locally or be able to spend. And so I think there are sentiments moving that direction. It's just, it'll be interesting to see how some of this stuff plays out over the next bit. How do you think, kind of leading into that, what do you think is sort of required? And I guess one of the questions that I've kind of had is like, super cool idea if people can basically make their own currency and run, program their own values into their own networks and then have them interoperate. And even, maybe even you have a floating like open market exchange rate for, Calgary coin versus Toronto coin, for example, or, Mumbai or, Rio. Like you could have these different things based on almost taking it one layer lower. But do you think that's actually, I guess, viable, or how do you think that something like that may happen? Because I know you've been doing a lot of research into the history of banking and, community banking and some of the challenges around our current, I guess, structural financial system and the challenges there. How do you kind of see these things? I guess first off, what's the problems that you're seeing with our existing structure? Like, why is it no good other than the fact that you could have these cascading effects? Like, wouldn't this make it worse? And if not, why not? Maybe you can dive into a little bit of that.
So, I should hedge all this by saying I'm a complete amateur economist. So I have no economic credentials. And, these are most of this comes from my biophysical intuitions, let's say, right, from studying ecosystems and organisms and my understanding of what sustainability means and the organism as the sort of quintessential sustainable system, right? And to me, sustainability, my understanding of sustainability and what it means to be sustainable is that you have a system is sustainable if it has an internal model of its environment that it can use to actually adapt, right? So there's this sort of representational function that an organism has to have, that internally within the organism, it has to do a good job of representing the kinds of patterns and changes in its environment so that it can respond to them, right? And so I like to use the model of like, a hurricane, which is something that doesn't represent its environment, right? It's this emergent structure, it's very beautiful, but it just runs down, right? And when it crashes into land, it's sort of over, right? And it leaves a lot of destruction in its path. And so I sort of believe that the way we've structured our economy, this sort of pursuit of infinite growth and just like all we care about is GDP, it fails to actually, within the structure of the economy and especially within the structure of money, it fails to actually represent the environment that we're embedded in, the ecological environment and even the social environment and the key things that actually sustain us, right? And so we're a lot like the hurricane, maybe our economy is this sort of beautiful emergent hurricane-like structure, but because it fails to represent its boundaries, it's just going to crash into them and burn, right? And that's sort of the path our economies are headed on. And so, at some level, I'm trying to understand how we can correct that. But then there's this sort of deeper, maybe not deeper, but this other component, which is like the structure of our monetary institutions and just how much they have contributed to inequality in the world through the sort of, pathway that money takes to getting created and then distributed, right? And the sort of,
Totally.
Starting at the central banks and then being distributed to the sort of, dealers at the banks and so on, and trickles down and mostly has just led to, trickles down, but has mostly led to like, financial asset bubbles. And doesn't actually seem to get into the hands of people, and levels of inequality are just, growing rampantly. And so obviously there's many reasons for this, but one does seem to be this sort of, current structure of our monetary systems. And so, how do we actually address this? How can we build real local economic systems that can fix things like this or start to chip away at them? I mean, you look at a lot of these community currencies like the Calgary dollar, whatever, the Toronto dollar failed. I don't think it's around anymore. And they're largely gimmicks. They're like toys. They're like, oh, look, like we can do something nice. And like, yeah, it's nice, but is it really going to make a difference? And those kinds of things where you sort of, you buy the Calgary dollar for $1 and the dollar sits in the bank and someone will redeem it later for 95 cents or whatever. Like, that's not really the model I'm championing here. I think those are nice and there's a lot of potential for those things. I'm more so the things I've been quite inspired by recently are mutual credit systems and more generally liquidity saving mechanisms, which are liquidity saving is something that's well understood by financial institutions, right? At the end of every day, all the banks get together at a clearinghouse and they net out all the payments between each other so that the amount of cash that each one has to come up with to sort of settle their balances on, at the end of the day is minimal compared to the gross flows, right? But these kinds of clearing operations aren't accessible to, they save the banks maybe trillions of dollars a year in actual liquidity requirements.
But the savings don't get passed on to.
Exactly. They're not accessible to the average business, right? So imagine there were clearinghouses for networks of businesses that are all doing business with each other. I mean, if I owe you and you owe some other guy and they owe me, we can clear that without any of us having to come up with any money, just by surfacing the information about the fact that there's a closed loop between us. And these kinds of closed loop, these flows are at the heart of sustainable systems, right? They are, representations of a kind of pattern of activity that, if you recognize them as such, can actually be made to be sustainable, essentially, right? Because you don't have to come up with new inflows to support them. You can just sort of clear them and sort of keep them going. And so, the sort of at the heart of what I'm aspiring for or what I'm proposing or pushing is this idea that just by surfacing information about local flows in economies and these kinds of local loops, we could actually save small businesses huge amounts of liquidity, which directly affects their bottom line, because no longer do they have to come up with the cash. They can just clear it with each other. And that by doing that, we can start to actually grow those kinds of loops, right? And thereby sort of compound wealth and value in local economies by strengthening the sets of flows and thus the local supply chain and so on. And so there's a number of examples of relatively successful mutual credit kinds of systems like this. So there's the Veerbank in Switzerland, which emerged after the Great Depression in the 30s, and a lot of community currency showed up after. When there's a serious credit crunch and liquidity disappears, there's still lots of goods and services. There's still people that need things, people that offer things, but the medium of exchange is gone, right? And so what do people do is they start issuing script, they issue other media of exchange, right?
Or they barter, or they borrow other mediums of exchange. I think we're seeing this play out in real time in Venezuela right now, right? For the most part, people are using US dollars to transact as much as they can because nobody wants to hold the devaluing currency. It's a game of hot potato, basically.
Right. But in the case of the 30s, it was the US dollar that had a liquidity crisis, right? No one could even come up with US dollars. And so there were all these community currencies that emerged, and most of them got stamped out because the central banks were like, no, we don't want anything to do with this. But the Veerbank got around it by just incorporating as a bank, right? And so they're a mutual credit system that's probably the longest lasting and the largest example of a complementary current system that, there's some research that shows that it actually has a meaningful impact on stabilizing the Swiss economy, especially during liquidity crises or larger sort of credit crunches, right? And so there was a paper also earlier this year on liquidity saving mechanisms that studied the Sardex mutual credit system, which has emerged in Sardinia, but also a trade credit clearing system in Slovenia that's operated for a few decades that allows small businesses essentially in Slovenia that trade with each other to clear their credit, right? So essentially saving their liquidity. And what this paper showed is that if you were to combine these two mechanisms of this sort of trade clearing plus mutual credit for a network of small businesses, you can save them up to 50% of their liquidity requirement. That's effectively like cutting your costs or expenses in half just by surfacing the information about who you're trading with, right? So, for me, the problem with our monetary systems is they don't actually surface this kind of information. It's very centralized, abstracted, high level, like, oh, the central bank, we can tweak interest rates and print money and give it to banks and then they'll lend it out. And that's our representation of the economy. That is, maybe that worked in the 19th century or something, or partially in the 20th century, but society today is way too complex for that. And I think we really need to have these more local mechanisms, these more local, you don't even need to create a new medium of exchange to do this kind of clearing, right? You just do the clearing and the debts are cleared and that's that. And that carries a function of money, but it's not sort of, its own money, but you can build monies on top of that, right? And that's the direction I think can be, that has the most promise for actually getting the ball rolling, where you can set up these sorts of, business cooperatives, essentially cooperative between many businesses that do business with each other, that, enforce these sort of local supply chains and enable them to save potentially huge amounts of liquidity just by servicing the information about these closed flows. And even if it takes, 50 businesses to close the loop, there's still a loop, and you can still recognize that, and that's the sort of the stuff of sustainable economy. So that's the kind of thing I'm really excited about. And we see there's a project in Kenya that it's called Grassroots Economics that have sort of been doing this. They built a mutual credit system out there that, they've been operating since long before blockchains came around, but now they've been leveraging the sort of digital currency technology and, bonding curves and so on to facilitate this. And they have like tens of thousands of small businesses doing this, engaging in this kind of commerce. And so that's the kind of model I think has a lot of potential. And, I'm not advocating that this is a replacement per se for central banks, or that we're competing with them, or that, they're all evil. Like, there's a lot of malice, I would say, maybe somewhere in the history, but I think a lot of bankers today, and, I've gained actually quite a bit of respect for the institutions of banking and, what they're actually trying to solve, compared to where I was, say, 10 years ago when I was buying, physical silver. But the thing for me is I think we can actually build a better foundation for national currencies by sort of connecting them to these webs of local currencies. And so we can sort of build up the structure of a national currency as a representation of, these more local media of exchange or credit clearing systems and so on. So that's sort of, what I'm working towards. And I surely don't have it all figured out. I think there's tons of research that needs to be done. We need to sort of revive the field of, optimum currency areas. And, I think a lot of people just kind of concluded, the optimum currency area is the whole world. And so, everyone should just use the US dollar, but like, I don't think that's good. So.
No, I think with every experimentation, you end up learning, right? You end up having some byproduct or some side effect that wasn't expected, but that's part of progress. It's been a bit since we chatted, so it's really interesting because we've been thinking about very similar things, but from afar. And I think, you're totally right. I mean, this is actually one of the things that we've been working towards at Bidali too, is that coming from a different area, we started off doing stuff in the gift card space. So, I mean, to bring back to what we were doing, the initial idea was, look, we think that the future of money is going to be crypto in some form because it's just better. Like, overall, more secure, more auditable, easier to move around, all these things. It's just better. But how you realize that vision is you need, stability. You needed a bunch of the infrastructure to be able to exchange currencies. You needed the ability to send and receive it easily and accept it as a payment. And so I think right now we're at this inflection point where, people have been able to accept payments in Bitcoin and other things for a decade now. But usually the question is like, well, how do I actually take the value that I've received and use it to, as a business, like pay my employees or pay for my rent or pay for the supplies that I need or pay my supply chain. And, part of that's a network effect that needs to be built up by people starting to accept this, but there were barriers to that in terms of tooling, ease of use, and even stability has been a big barrier. The volatility is not conducive to this. So I think this is where now with dollar pegged crypto assets giving us the perceived stability that we've got right now, that makes it a lot more palatable. And that infrastructure, that's basically what we've been building towards over the last while. In order to start to do that, though, we said, okay, you need to be able to spend at places you care about. So we're like, what's the easiest way to do that? Well, we could enable people to buy gift cards. And as a result, this was 2 years ago, as like a prototype, or 3 years ago now. But we recognized that even within the gift card space, that especially over the last year, I was like, wait, these are just mutual credit systems. What if you could actually swap like Amazon dollar for Walmart, or like a local currency for Amazon, and like, basically make all these things interoperable? You could enable these mutual credit systems, which would save, as you mentioned, I didn't know it was as high as 50%. I'd seen that paper, but hadn't had a chance to read it yet. And I mean, even what we identified is like, look, at a minimum, you'd be able to save people, 10 to 15% and be able to actually pass those savings on to a consumer, a business would. But the other side that we recognize too is that this mechanism of issuing credit as a business is not that dissimilar from what a central bank does, right? But the problem, as you kind of highlighted, and what we had actually been thinking about and kind of talking with different governments about, is inverting the flow of funds, which is a huge structural shift. But right now, as a result of the COVID pandemic, I mean, even I'll use Canada as an example. We had a bunch of fiscal stimulus go in that goes central bank to commercial bank to business and end user. And once the government issues that credit to the commercial banks, they lose visibility into where this stuff goes. And as a result, there's a bunch of fraud. There's a bunch of, poor or mismanaged distribution. I'd say it worked out pretty well considering, but, definitely not great. And what we were thinking is like, what if you can actually invert the flow by basically flattening this architecture? And I think that's very similar to what you're proposing, where it's, instead of going central bank to commercial bank to end consumer or business, going the other way and enabling consumers or businesses to then redeem these at commercial banks. So inverting the flow, but then that makes it way more efficient for distributing funds. And you're never going to get rid of fraud entirely, but I think because of this technology, you have much more visibility into the distribution. And as a result, that can then seed things for creating a more bottoms up mutual credit system, but without completely, tearing everything to pieces and disrupting it. So we've actually been working on some of this stuff, concepts, and we're hoping to be able to prove it out with the Bermuda government, over the next year or two, because one of the things that we've been working with them for about a year now. And because they don't have a central bank. So one of the challenges that they have is that they can't even just go and issue stimulus as easily. And they're a small nation. So the ability for them to create a community currency is actually, they already have a Bermuda dollar, which is pegged to the US dollar, but to be able to create a truly community currency, I think is much more feasible there, as well as there's political, buying, and Premier David Burt is super progressive in thinking about the space and seeing where it's going. But I think to me, the challenge that we've had to date around some of this is that, to your point about surfacing that information, we have the internet of information, right? So right now there's an asymmetry where information travels much, much faster than value can transfer, right? And around the world. And I think that's why, as we become more globally connected, you end up having much larger ripple effects on one corner of the planet affect somewhere else, because the information shifts much faster than the value can adapt, the value chains can adapt. And I think that's the really interesting thing about what you are talking about, is how you can actually bring that up to par so that information and value can transfer at relatively the same speed in terms of leveling things out. So I think it's fascinating catching up and hearing, thinking about similar things, but coming from a slightly different perspective. I definitely think there's something there. And that's something that we're working towards as well, is, trying to test out some of these ideas, because at the end of the day, they haven't really been done before. This is all new stuff. So I think with that in mind, thank you for joining me on Real Vision. Thank you for all the work that you've been doing and the thinking about this space. I'm excited to see what you guys do at Informal Systems and where the ecosystem is going with Cosmos. I think the recent IBC, or inter-blockchain communication launch, is going to be pretty critical, both for the Cosmos ecosystem as well as the space as a whole. So we'll get to see some of these experiments kind of play out.
For sure. Yeah. And we have, the Cosmos blockchain, the Cosmos Hub blockchain was sort of one of the first of many Cosmos blockchains. And now there's, Terra and Binance and Crypto.com and many others. We're sort of looking at that as a we call it a port city into the sort of larger ecosystem, right? A way to connect in, and it's being designed as a chain to really service the needs of all the other blockchains, but also to help start to think about stitching together, all these different local monies into a more coherent system. And so having IBC at the heart of it as this interoperability protocol to sort of get that started in a somewhat coherent way is really exciting for us. And we've got this DEX that's going to be launching on the Cosmos Hub, hopefully in the next month or so, that will start to unlock the ability to trade all these different currencies, without having to go on to centralized exchanges and worry about the custody risk and so on. But we'll also open up new opportunities for experimenting with economic design and with monetary design, and that's really I'm really excited about that, about the future of the Cosmos Hub and the larger ecosystem, and monetary localism in general. So
it's fascinating. It's going to be really exciting, I think, to see what happens over the next year or two, even projecting 5 years out. I think right now we're at a state where nobody really knows and truly where the world's going, both on a political side as well as the financial side. I think the general consensus is it's not going the way everybody had hoped or planned. And it'll be interesting to see if this ends up transitioning into a different way that we operate both locally and globally. So,
for sure.
Yeah. A pleasure as always, Ethan. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me.
See ya.
Take care.